once again, welcome back to RPMbassy. Today I'm talking about an album, as you can see right here, a classic that I think everybody at least knows one song off of, and I think for many is a very loved album, and it is Peter Gabriel's So. So this is Peter Gabriel's fifth album, released in 1986. It's his first solo album that isn't a self-titled album. So everything previous had been just titled Peter Gabriel, and then they've sort of had names attached to them over the years, but they were all, as far as titles officially go, just all called Peter Gabriel. So this is the first one with a real title, and it was, I think, done as a kind of as a way to stick it to the label who had asked for an actual title and to be a bit more marketable, and so he just gone So, which I love that kind of rebellious nature. As far as the actual music itself, not overly rebellious, it's very accessible in fact, and I would say that this, certainly compared to his work with Genesis and then on to his solo work, this is by far and away the most accessible music that he had made to date. And it's got a ton of names that we will know sort of sprinkled around it. You've got Nile Rodgers on here, you've got Stuart Copeland on here, loads and loads of just little bits and pieces. Kate Bush, of course, is on one of the tracks on this. So yeah, very, very accessible album and full of popular figures that we all know and love. As far as the album itself goes, it did fantastically. So the song Sledgehammer was kind of what really propelled it into big popularity. That reached #1 in Canada and the US and #4 in the UK, that individual single. And the album itself went on to go #1 in a ton of countries, the UK being one of them, of course. Hit #2 on the US Billboard album charts. So obviously this did very well. Hit #1 in the UK, hit #2 in the US Billboard, which is a bit weird that the song Sledgehammer in the UK didn't do as well as it did in the US, but then the album itself did better. Perhaps it's just because he's an English recording artist, perhaps that helped in some way, shape or form. But yeah, very accessible music, very enjoyable music, very well produced album. I think as far as mixing goes, this is one that a lot of people over the years have perhaps drawn inspiration from in terms of the sound and timbre of an album. I will say though that this album, as far as the mastering on vinyl goes, a little bit off. It sounds great, but this isn't an album that you can just put on and set to a single level and then sit back and listen to the whole thing. I found that certainly, at least with this pressing, there's quite a difference between different levels of song. So we'll get into the songs as a whole in a minute, but Red Rain, first track on the album, sounds fantastic, obviously. Volume wise and level wise, perfectly acceptable. As soon as it goes into Sledgehammer, especially the element that I love the most personally, the sort of sampled shakuhachi flute at the beginning, that's very, very quiet, and I think the entire song is almost like 4 or 5 or like decibels lower than the rest of the album. Whether or not it's because it's a bit more of a dense kind of mix and perhaps it needed to be brought down, but I found myself with that having to actually get up and turn the volume up when I was listening to the album. But all in all, it still sounds fantastic, and I can't really fault the production and the mixing choices outside of those sort of few small quirks with the leveling. So I mentioned earlier on that there are a lot of names on this album. Like the personnel list is pretty long, and some of it is bizarre. As I said, Stuart Copeland was on here. One of the tracks he's credited as just doing hi-hat. I assume that he did a bit more than that, but I guess they sort of flew him in just to hit a cymbal a bit on one track. But the actual initial production sessions for this album were pretty intimate all in all. So you have David Rhodes, a guitarist, you've got Daniel Lanois, the producer, and then Peter Gabriel himself. And I've read some stories about Peter Gabriel being very sort of procrastinating when it came to doing his vocal parts and things like that, and he eventually was sort of like locked away in a vocal booth until he kind of did his work. But it seems as well that he also had sort of 2 separate spaces, one where he would work on vocals, one where he would work on music, using like like a Prophet and I believe a Fairlight CMI and things like that. So I think perhaps he threw himself a lot into the music and not so much into writing the vocals. But at the end of it, you can't really tell. I think all of it really sort of, it feels very cohesive and very thought out. And I think to a degree, based on another story I'll mention in a moment, I think perhaps Peter Gabriel maybe second-guessed himself a lot on some of his work. There's a drum section in Sledgehammer, which apparently was recorded basically at the very last minute. The drummer was about to get a taxi and was leaving the country, and Peter Gabriel convinced him to come in and do a take. He got the take in one go, and Peter Gabriel wanted it done again and again and again to get it perfect, but actually you can't see it or hear any faults within that solo and that drum part. So I think perhaps he was sort of almost a little bit too blinded by this pursuit of perfection. But when you look at it at the end of it, there's actually nothing on here that I can say went wrong. There's no bum notes, there's no duff takes or anything like that. Like, it is so solid start to finish. But having listened to like a lot of his work over the years, I think he does kind of seem to be that kind of person, and especially like with his use of like a Fairlight, and he used an EMU like an emulator, the sampler on here as well. I think perhaps that's something with him where he's always got to have this kind of like new pursuit of new technologies and try new things, and to try and like basically throw everything into it that he can to try and achieve his desired result. And even now, like I've seen, you know, in recent years, he's been throwing new technologies at his more recent works, and like he's gotten really, really deep into things like AI and stuff recently. Whether or not I agree with that, I'm not so sure on that, but he definitely seems like someone who isn't willing to stand still when it comes to music production and things like that. As far as the production and the arrangements go, there's a lot of Brazilian and African influence in this, and percussionally especially, like the list of personnel is mostly percussionists, I would say, and you can kind of see why, you know, especially if they're willing to get Stuart Copeland in to hit hi-hat. There's a ton of intricate percussion within the entire album, and I think it lends a lot of flavour to it that otherwise, you know, a drum kit otherwise wouldn't work alone. And you've got sampled and synthesized drums on here. There's plenty of Lin drum on this, and I believe that was one of the things he used as for his main demos. It was essentially him with like a keyboard and a Lin drum, and that was how he sort of built the initial tracks out. And then people would be brought in, they'd listen to it essentially on sort of like two separate setups. So they'd have one that was playing the demo, they'd record their part onto a second setup, they'd listen to that, and then they kind of go back and sort of do the same again. So it's almost like that refining process of recording and redubbing and punching in new tracks and things like that. Again, which to me speaks of his kind of pursuit of like the perfect take and the perfect overall result. But I don't know, I think at some point you kind of just have to let a track go, and there's no such thing as perfect, you know. And for me, as an outside listener, I cannot fault this, and I think the overall result of it is phenomenal. And I think a lot of people, if you haven't heard the album and you're just familiar with the singles, as I've said many times on here, please delve into this, because there are some phenomenal tracks, and we'll go through them now. So Red Rain, that sort of ballad of a track, really huge sounding anthemic track that opens up the album, and that for me is almost a perfect album opener. And it's weird how it doesn't really set the tone at all, because you kind of, it feels almost like introspective and melancholic, but it's big and sort of huge, and that sort of melancholy you perhaps would be lured into thinking that that's going to be the whole album, and then you hit with Sledgehammer, which is just like the most fun song ever. And despite what I said with it being very low in terms of volume, if you want to test a pair of speakers out, really crank them up and play Sledgehammer through it. That and I'm going to tear your Playhouse Down by Paul Young. Those are two fantastic, fantastic tracks to test a pair of speakers because of the sort of the fretless bass use in them, especially with like an octave pedal. And that sound is, like, for me, is really iconic. And to be honest, it's kind of the reason why I ended up buying a fretless bass. You know, I have tons and tons of guitars, and a fretless bass was always on the list. And really, it is Sledgehammer that is kind of responsible for me ending up buying a fretless bass. The bass is played by Tony Levin on that track, and I think that is sort of up there as one of his best tracks ever. And yeah, his sort of sound, that fretless bass with an octave pedal played with a pick, it's a different tonality than most people are used to, but it kind of makes the bass a focal point in the track, and it holds so much melody in what is already such a dense melodic track. You know, you've got all of these like horn, trumpet sections and things, and tons of synthesizer, and there's really reverby bass, and of course Gabriel's vocals as well. And yeah, it's so dense, it's so rich, but everything kind of sits perfectly, it feels right. It's such a fun song to listen to, and I think, as I said, perfect song for testing speakers, but a perfect song to look at in terms of arrangement, songwriting, and kind of like mixing, like the prioritization of where things sit in terms of stereo balance and things like that. So obviously we all know that. The song itself, of course, did really well, and it was nominated or won like a record number of MTV Music awards. Like I think it won or something, got like 9 awards, which is insane for the music video. But it is a very cool video, that like weird stop motion thing. I think something like that today would have been achieved with some sort of weird CGI crap, but back then, you know, you kind of just had to work with the technology that was there. But it's definitely like a feat of technology, and it must have been a absolutely arduous recording session to try and record that video and get it shot. But it came out really great, and that I think sort of speaks to the fun of that track especially. Track 3 is Don't Give Up. That is the Kate Bush duet on this album, and a very nice one. It is kind of a bit of a palate cleanser, but also does bring the mood down a little bit from Sledgehammer, but it's very hard to try and follow that song up. You know, you're not going to be able to really match that in terms of energy at all. But it is a very nice song, and it certainly feels like, to me, more of a Kate Bush song than it does a Peter Gabriel song. There's a sort of more of a singer-songwritery vibe to me that kind of fits her more than it does him. It's not that he doesn't fit well in the song, but it certainly feels like it's her time to shine with that track. Another couple important songs on here. In Your Eyes. So this is the first track on side B, but Peter Gabriel actually wanted it to be the final track on the album. And I remember when I first heard the song, I was very surprised that it wasn't the final track, because it has very much has like final track energy. It feels more grandiose than the rest of the album, and it does have a sort of that kind of finishing touch, that sort of zenith to it, which I think doesn't quite sit as well where it's placed on the album. And apparently this is something that he sort of, again, fussed about so deeply when he was making the album, that he'd recorded a cassette that just had all the different variations of outros to song going into the intros of other songs, so he could work out the perfect flow for the album, which again must have been an arduous task to just record all these possible variations to get that sort of perfect. And then in the end he was told that he couldn't have In Your Eyes be the final track anyway, because essentially the nature of the vinyl being what it is, it was too dense of a song to fit on the sort of inner grooves of the album, because they're not quite as wide apart as the sort of beginning of a side, which is a shame. And I believe on the CD versions they did rectify that and they made that the final track. And they also added another song called This Is the Picture, but it's not on this version, so I won't really delve into that. The sort of final bits and pieces on side B, Mercy Street and We Do What We're Told. There's also Big Time, which is a great song, but Mercy Street and We Do What We're Told, for me, more important. Mercy Street being that is, in my opinion, the best track on the album, and probably the one that goes under the radar for a lot of people. So this wasn't released as a single, Mercy Street, but it feels a very deep song. Musically, it's fantastic. Feels complementary to Red Rain for me, but it's a little bit longer, a little bit more percussion based. It did get a music video, interestingly, but for whatever reason, it was never an official single. But I do recommend it if you haven't heard or seen the music video. Like, really check that one out. It's one of his strongest songs of his entire discography, as far as I'm concerned. And then the final song on this version of the album, this specific pressing, We Do What We're Told, Milgram's 37. So a bit of a weird one. It's kind of like an ambient track in a way, and this is why I don't think this track listing, I wish there would have been a way for Peter Gabriel's preferred track listing to make it onto these sort of initial pressings, because it's not quite the right song to end an album on. It's a good song, but it's quite moody and, as I say, ambient. And there's not even a ton of Gabriel on there. Like, there are vocals, but they sort of take a back seat to this sort of like instrumental, almost atmospheric instrumental. And it would have served as an excellent palate cleanser before then going in to an actual final track. So that, if I had to fault the album in any way, it would be just that difference in mastering and that the fact that they didn't get the final track that they wanted to in the way that it should have been. Now, I think in about 2002, there was a pressing that was done, which was 8 songs long, like the original album, but it had In Your Eyes as the final track and not We Do What We're Told. That was relegated back to track number 7, where Peter Gabriel wanted it to be. I would say if you can get hold of a copy that has that arrangement on it, you've got yourself a perfect masterpiece. It's a masterpiece anyway, but just that extra bit, that's the cherry on top. So I highly recommend getting it. If you can't get one of those pressings and you just want to grab a copy of it, these are dirt cheap. You know, it's from an era where pressings were so numerous, so you can get copies of this very, very, very easily. And I'm sure there are special editions and things like that, but I haven't looked too deep into it. But I presume next year we'll probably be getting the 40th anniversary of it. So I will keep an eye out for that, because I'd love to have like a special edition gatefold and, you know, get some pictures of like the production, the studio photography and stuff like that. And then maybe we could have that initial sort of intended track list and then have the extra tracks, but have them be a separate LP just on the side as a nice bonus. So I think that for me, that would be like the perfect combination. But for the time being, this is the one. I highly recommend it. It's a phenomenal album, sounds great to try out with any number of sets of speakers, and I think anyone can enjoy this. Doesn't matter what you're into. You know, if you haven't heard it, try it. I can almost guarantee you're going to love it. So that is Peter Gabriel's So. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.